Welcome to Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I am your host, Deepak from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. Tom Williams, Associate Professor of Computer Science at the Colorado School of Mines, as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. To start us off, allow me to introduce the voice behind today's conversation. Dr. Tom Williams is an associate professor of computer science at Colorado School of Mines, where he directs the Mines Interactive Robotics Research Lab. His work sits at the intersection of artificial intelligence, human-robot interaction, and cognitive science, with a particular focus on language-capable robots that are sensitive to environmental, social, and moral context. A leading voice in the field, he is the author of Degrees of Freedom on Robotics and Social Justice, which examines how robot design and deployment can either reinforce or challenge existing power structures. His research has been supported by major grants and early career awards from organizations such as the National Science Foundation, NASA, and the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. And he is widely recognized as an influential mentor to the next generation of human robot interaction scholars. In today's episode, Dr. Tom Williams shares key insights from his acclaimed book, Degrees of Freedom on Robotics and Social Justice. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tom Williams to the conversation. Professor Tom, it's a distinguished privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. We are grateful for you to accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Thank you. Professor, your book argues that robots can reinforce what you call the white patriarchal robot imaginary. Could you briefly unpack this idea and how it shapes mainstream robotics today?
Yeah, absolutely. So today, if we're talking about robot imaginaries, right? These are the broader conceptions we have of robotics, of what robots look like, where they're supposed to be used, who they are supposed to serve, and so forth. And these imaginaries are jointly shaped by forces in science fiction and in engineering, right? Kids grow up watching science fiction. This inspires them to get into engineering. They build technologies that appear like what they saw in science fiction, and then the technologies of today shape the science fiction of tomorrow. And in my book, I talk about the origins of robots in terms of what we would consider robots today and the ways that those emerged in the aftermath of the U.S. Civil War to tell very specific types of stories, both in engineering and in science fiction at the exact same moment in time, and how that shaped the evolution of robots across science fiction and engineering. And the ways that today, then, robots, because of that history, continue to reinforce power systems that tend to benefit, especially in the United States and Europe, white men in terms of what robots look like and what sort of stereotypes those reinforce in terms of who robots are intended to serve, where robots are deployed, how robots perceive people, how robots engage in reasoning, and so forth.
Professor, you use the term new Jim Cobots to describe certain social robots. What turns an otherwise helpful robot into a new Jim Cobot? And why does that framing matter for designers and policymakers?
Yeah, so the here I'm drawing on these two theories. So Michelle Alexander has this fantastic book. It's, I don't know, 15 years old or something at this point now, um, about the new Jim Crow, where she analyzes in the United States the ways that that the U.S. legal institutions are structured in ways that continue to reinforce these Jim Crow-like systems of power and continue to operate in ways where, by design, they serve to round up and imprison huge numbers of people of color, and then after those people are released from prison, relegate them to sort of second-class citizen status. Similarly, Ruha Benjamin builds on this theory in her book Race After Technology and presents this theory of the new Jim Code, thinking about ways that algorithmic systems today, especially in areas like automatic sentencing systems, recidivism prediction, where in the United States, when somebody is arrested for a crime, whether they get bail or how long their sentence is decided by or in collaboration with an algorithm that makes this recommendation, provides it to the judge, and then often the judge runs with it. And the ways that those algorithmic systems are trained on data that is sort of racist in nature, right? And encodes previous sentencing decisions that were racially motivated, that then serve as training data, that then lead to these algorithmic systems today making decisions that continue to be grounded in those same racist decisions, but in ways that are obscured. And so in the book, I talk about the ways that robots today may also serve to reinforce um, uh, specific like white and male patterns of behavior in ways that may exacerbate some of these problems in the US legal system. One of the areas in which I'm particularly concerned about this is in robotics for education, where I think that there's a lot of great uses for robots in education, and we're seeing more and more exciting work on this coming out every year. But these robots are not just educating. And we've seen instances of robots being programmed to do things like, pay attention to uniforms and call out, uniform violations. Pay attention to whether kids are missing or late and taking attendance in that way, and calling out disruptive behaviors. And sometimes these things are important, right? And like calling out disruptive behaviors, our lab has done work on robots calling out sexism, for example. And our lab's research has shown that if robots don't call out problematic behaviors, people might take that as a signal that the robot like approves of them, right? It's like tacit endorsement, and that can shift people's perspectives. So in some cases, it is important to call out, negative behaviors, but we should still be concerned about that in the ways that, algorithmic assessment of uniform code violations, truancy, and ostensibly disruptive behaviors could lead to disciplinary action being taken towards students. And the United States, 200,000 students per year are referred to law enforcement for uniform violations, truancy, and ostensibly disruptive behaviors. And students that are disproportionately impacted by this are students of color, right? And so there's this concern here that if robots are being programmed to enforce these same sort of norms of behavior that are used to feed kids into the school to prison pipeline, then robots could serve as these sort of enforcers of the new Jim Crow and could exacerbate the school to prison pipeline. The other way I talk about this is through the lens of like whites only water fountains, right? If we think about the Jim Crow, where in the 1950s, 1960s in the United States had racist segregation policies where Black Americans, were not allowed to use the same entrances into buildings. They were not allowed to use the same water fountains, etc. You had these like whites only water fountains. We can think about robots today that are often, because computer vision algorithms often have different levels of performance for people with different skin colors, right? Then robots that are not able to effectively recognize people with darker skin may inadvertently be denying services to people based off of the color of their skin, and may end up serving as sort of like the modern technological equivalent of whites only water fountains. And even though they're not intentionally, hopefully, being designed in this way by robot designers, despite the roboticist's intention, because of the sensors they're using and the limitations of those sensors, they may serve the same purpose.
Professor, a major thread in the book is how robot design can either erase or serve marginalized communities. How should we rethink who designs robot and who robots are designed for? if we want robotics to advance social justice?
Yeah, so I think that tying this back to the history of robotics, right? Like the original robots, like you see in on the cover of the book, this is a patent, like the first U.S. robotics patent, I think, in 1868, like which was designed like in the image of a stereotype of a black man, right? And it's basically this black mechanical man serving, a white master, which then inspired the first robot in science fiction, which was this black mechanical man serving this white master. And historically, we've had across both engineering and science fiction this image of robots basically being like servants for wealthy white men, and even like the father of the first industrial robot arm, Joseph Engelberger, when he was asked like what the purpose of robots were when he was putting robots in the factory, he said, "Well, we can't have slaves or kick around black people anymore. So the robot serves that purpose." Explicitly being like, "Well, we're not allowed to, have slaves anymore." And this was 100 years after the end of slavery, and motivating that of like, well, who is going to serve wealthy, white factory owners? uh it's the robot, right? And so this image of like, well, why are we designing robots as like servants for wealthy white men? Even today, if we look at a lot of the humanoid robots that are coming out, right? And there's a lot of talk around like, oh, well, why are we designing these robots? Either it's like for factories, or people will talk about like butlers, like, oh, I want to develop like a robot butler, which is basically saying like want to have like a mechanical servant like for rich people, right? And so today, if we follow the dominant narrative of robotics, the vision is like, well, designing these mechanical servants for wealthy people, and in the United States at least, that typically would mean like wealthy white men. And so I think that we should be looking as a community to how we could be designing robots that serve other communities instead. And there's a variety of different methods we could use that have different pros and cons, right? This could just be when we are designing robots, as robot designers, we say, hmm, who is this robot really helping, right? And how can we make sure it's not designed in a way where it's only going to be usable or only adhere to the norms or otherwise only benefit like wealthy white guys? Um, the second approach we could take is like a participatory design approach, where we say, okay, well, let's work with other communities to see how robots might meet their needs. So, for example, my lab is currently working with unhoused survivors of domestic violence at a shelter in Denver and co-designing robots with them to say, well, what are the things you struggle with? And for them, it's like practicing like disclosing their experiences to others, and then thinking about, well, how can we design robots with them that meet their needs in the way that they want them to be met, and thinking about like what those robots should feel like, whether they should talk or not, and how different types of users in that environment want the robots to be designed, both in terms of the morphology and the interaction design. And then the third approach would be something like design justice, where we would say, actually, like let's like flatten these power relationships. Instead of having the technologist be in this at all, why don't we as roboticists build tools that allow communities to decide for themselves what the create kits that allow communities to like prototype their own robots, right? Or design software that allows the communities to design their own like prompts for controlling an LLM based robot, right? um and so we've got this spectrum of methods that go from like most roboticist input to most community input. And in some ways, this means that like as you're going down the spectrum, you are further empowering users. However, as you're going down the spectrum, you're also sort of abdicating responsibility, right? If you put the tools into people's hands and say, go play, you are sort of giving up your own ability to engage in ethical reasoning, right? And at that point, it's like, well, the user community said, it's their decision, right? And we see this like problems with this in things like robot voices, right? Where like Apple, for example, got a lot of pushback on the fact that their voices in like Siri tended to be like um, American and British white people, right? And especially at the beginning, American and British white women, like which is like reinforcing this image of like in the United States of like like white women in these particular types of administrative service labors. And so the good thing they did was created a broader range of voices, right? The problem with what them and like companies like them did, right, is said, okay, well, we're just going to allow people to choose for themselves what voices to use, which seems fine. But the problem with that is if the reason why the voices at the beginning were tended to be like white women is because of stereotypes in the United States around who serves in that role, then you could expect then when people choose for themselves what voice they're going to use, they're probably also going to use that voice that plays into that stereotype and continues to reinforce that stereotype, right? And so I think it's complicated. Like, well, what should we use? We can continue. We can consider all of these, but ultimately, we wanted to pursue this in a way that empowers users while not completely abdicating our responsibilities, especially if we are technologists who have thought about these issues a lot and are like, oh, geez, we don't want our robots being designed that in ways that reinforce these stereotypes. And we've thought about this a lot. Then we should use that fact that we've thought about this and the consequences of different designs to help to steer the design of these robots as opposed to completely abdicating the responsibility. So I don't know what the answer is. I don't think there's a silver bullet answer, but there's options along the spectrum that all have different pros and cons.
Professor, you highlight speculative design and counterfactual design fiction as a tool to imagine different robot futures. Can you share an example of how these approaches might concretely shift real world robot design?
Yeah, so speculative design and speculative fiction is sort of this broad range of different types of like science fiction stories, right? And that envision different futures, right? And so a people might be familiar with like utopias and dystopias, right? This is one type of speculative fiction where you're envisioning this like ideal perfect society or this like really terrible negative future and as a way of envisioning like futures you want to pursue or futures you want to avoid. However, there's other approaches. So like Dunn and Robbie are these authors who have this great book on speculative design called Speculative Everything, and they talk about this range of different options, and some of the others are like counterfactual or alternative histories, right? Where you're explicitly saying, well, what if this particular element of today was a little bit different? What would things look like as opposed to envisioning a whole utopian society? Or what if things had evolved in a different way? What if robotics, instead of starting with, in this image of slaves, what if we had started robots in the image of animals? Or like you look at in Japan, I think Goku Tensoku, I think is how you pronounce it. This like first in response to Rossum's Universal Robots, the play, while America sort of doubled down on them that like robot worker imagery, Japanese roboticists said, "Oh, we don't want robots designed in that image," and so they explicitly, in response, designed robots that did not serve a purpose, task-wise, and instead were friends and were like social and could had social abilities and could talk, and that was their purpose, right? And so, like, what if that was the seed that really had blossomed and had fed the global evolution of robotics around the world? And to some extent, it has, but like it's sort of a different origin. Um, and so in the field of human robot interaction, people have been using these different types of speculative design exercises in different ways to envision different futures. I'll give two examples from other people. So one is Katie Winkle from Uppsala University in Sweden, who has a really cool paper from last year where she was using speculative design and design fictions to envision possible futures. Where what she did is she took these science fiction stories written by this like socialist from I think like the early 1900s that envisioned this possible future and sort of re-envisioned them with robots and used that to think about other alternate futures that might have different conceptualizations around labor infrastructure. A second is Michal Luria, who was at Carnegie Mellon, I believe, who did this project that I participated in as a research participant, where I think it was called like Letters from the Future or something. But where what she did is I gave her my address, And every couple months, I received a letter in the mail from this fictional company. So one month it was like this report on my child's progress in school with information on what the AI had gathered about them, right? And like each month it was like this different project. And when I received these letters in the mail, at first it was like shock. I was like, what is this? Like, I was reading it and it created this like really visceral emotional response to like, I don't know why I received this, but this is messed up. And then I was like, oh, wait, this is that study I agreed to participate in, right? And I'd forgotten because it had taken months. And so then I would give my responses of like how, these letters had caused me to react. And it was sort of like an immersive science fiction experience that I was participating in. And because it was science fiction, it invited you in to have a really genuine response. I had a paper at HRI at the Human Robot Interaction Conference last week where I talked about how some of these methods where it's a little bit less realistic might be more effective because it's a more genuine response, right? And so inviting somebody to participate to see theater or to participate in an immersive theater experience or other types of of these methods might be really effective for encouraging people to give like genuine responses about how they feel about a technology, as opposed to if they're brought into a lab and everything feels very sterile and artificial. In our lab, we're now using design fictions in order to help connect with our participatory design work. So in work that is like in prep, under review, like it's not published yet, but we've done work with community organizations that work with unhoused populations in Denver to understand their needs and where different sort of needs that could be met by technologies. And then we've used design fictions where we write short science fiction pieces based off of those needs, and that where a robot is meeting those needs, and then just use that as a point of discussion to be like, is this really realistic? Could a robot really be capable of this? Like if it was capable of that, would it really meet those needs in the ways that we're envisioning? And using that as a way of tying that need finding work to our science fiction and engineering practice. And we found that to be like a both, I think, an effective way, but also a very fun way of exploring these types of engineering processes as part of the design process.
Professor, the book distinguishes between revisiting, rethinking, and ripping up in the status quo in robotics.
Yeah.
Could you walk us through these three strategies and when each is appropriate?
Yeah, so I try in the book to provide sort of a menu of different strategies because I don't think for a lot of these problems it's like there is no one single silver bullet, I think, and there's lots of different strategies, and some of which are more radical than others, right? And both these different strategies have pros and cons, and they might um, be more or less radical or realistic to pursue, right? And I don't have a really clear delineation between them, but generally, I try to frame these as a sort of the lowest level is like working within the current status quo, right? Of saying like, well, we're not going to completely change how we do things, but we're going to try to be like less egregious, right? Um, so this might mean like designing robots that just like don't play into really, problematic stereotypes. The level below that, or the next level, I don't remember if I'm going up or down, but the next level is rethinking our relationship to the status quo, and changing how we orient towards it, right? So, in the case of designing robots, it might mean avoiding like maybe we don't make all of our robots human-like. Maybe not all of our robots talk, right? Maybe we try to explicitly avoid those elements of the status quo in ways that sort of change the orientation around robotics. And then finally, when we talk about ripping up the status quo, the goal there is to engage in this type of counterfactual and counter historical reasoning of saying, okay, the problems today we have originate from these particular origin points in history. If we change those origin points and try to go on a different trajectory, where might that lead us today, right? So if the problem there with robot design is not just them having egregious, stereotypes, or not just the fact that like human likeness or language capability in some circumstances lead to those egregious stereotypes, but the fact that um, our origin point in robotics was building the robots for white men, which has led to this particular evolution, then saying, well, if we went in a different direction, then that might mean that we're starting from a point where we were working with other types of communities. And if we're working with those communities from first principles, and not making any of these assumptions about what robots are and what they look like, how might that lead to different visions today? Which is obviously like more challenging, but would lead, yeah, I think, would lead to, a more fundamentally just future. Similarly, if we look in the book, I also a lot of it is about language capable and human like robots because I work in human robot interaction. But the last sort of meaty chapter is all about policing because I'm very concerned as well about the role of robots in policing, especially in the United States. And so similarly there, the sort of shallow approach might mean like, well, we just won't work with the police. The slightly more radical approach would be to say, well, maybe we rethink the relationship between robots and the police, right? And so maybe instead of building robots that are the police are using to surveil people, maybe we build robots that the police are or that sorry that people are using to watch the police, right? To document like violence towards protesters. And then the ripping up the status quo there means saying, well, what are police, right? Like, what is the history of policing? Where did they come from? Why did they exist the way they are today? And saying, maybe we should be pushing for police abolition, or maybe we should be pushing for just more fundamentally solutions to societal problems that don't require the involvement of the police. And there, that's something where, um, different people are going to fall at different points on that spectrum, right? Not everybody is going to, buy into a vision for police abolition, right? But maybe people would be willing to say, okay, well, based off of how the police are using robots right now, the least I can do is like not build surveillance systems that I'm giving to the police. So these are again three different levels that both represent um, uh, uh, fundamentally more and more radical solutions in ways that I think could lead to more and more like just and equitable futures, but also provide sort of different levels of engagement depending on people's individual values and perspectives and what they perceive as realistic.
Professor, you are critical of Kantian rule-based approaches to machine morality
Mhm.
that aim to encode explicit norms into robots. What are the hidden risks of this norm-driven model, especially for marginalized communities?
Yeah, so I have done a lot of work on like norm-driven approaches to robotics, where we say, okay, what are the rules that robots should follow, and we code them into the robots, right? And the point I make in the book is that there's sort of a weird history to these norm-based approaches that we don't talk about both in terms of philosophy and science fiction. So on the philosophy side, like a lot of these approaches go back to Immanuel Kant, Kantian deontology, right? Of saying like, well, we have these universal norms that we all agree people should follow, and so that's how we morally reason. Whereas modern political philosophers have pointed out that, well, the reason why Kant took that position is because he was also developing his race hierarchy. So for him, well, we all agree that this is what everybody should do. That's sort of like the we is like the other like wealthy white men that Kant was associating with. Similarly, in robotics and science fiction, Asimov has these three laws of robotics of for controlling robot behavior, but Asimov describes those laws as slave codes, as slave complexes. And the reason why he encoded them was one, because he was reading these science fiction stories about robots rising up and killing their white masters, and he was like, I don't want the robots to, the robot slaves to rise up. And second, because actually he credits the rules to his editor, John Campbell, who was an apologist for slavery. So we've got this, this famous infamous science fiction editor, John Campbell, influencing the 19-year-old Isaac Asimov to put in these like slave complexes into his robots, which is again is like messed up. And so I don't actually think that this means we need to completely throw out rule-based approaches to robotics, but it should maybe encourage us to explore other options. And so in our lab, for example, we've explored Confucian role ethics a lot. Confucian role ethics is all about the roles we play in relationships with others. Um, so between people, like what are those role relationships between me and somebody else? Am I their teacher? Am I their friend? Am I their son? Right? And what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to be a good teacher? What does it mean to be a good friend? What does it mean to be a good son? Um, and reasoning about that, and reasoning about like how we can help each other to morally cultivate our own virtues, right? How can we help other people? How can we like correct other people, right? Or like, say no to things, not to like yell at them, or not because they're wrong, but in order to help them to try to cultivate their own moral selves so that they can, help them train themselves to be better friends and teachers and sons. Um, Two caveats here. The first is that, as you may have noticed from me saying, like, father and son, for example, one of the problems with Confucian ethics is, like, historically, it is grounded in these very rigid hierarchies and, like, patriarchal roles and, like, with gender, and there's also problems there, right? So it's not like it's a silver bullet either. And second, we're actually, the way we use Confucian role ethics tends to combine it with norms, where we say, okay, well, what is the relationship that the robot is in with somebody else, or what is the relationship that the people it's interacting with have with others, and then what are the norms that are associated with that, right? So if somebody is a teacher, what does that mean that the teacher is like forbidden to do or obligated to do, right? And so this is a way of combining. We're still using roles, but in the context of these relationships and in the context of encouraging mutual moral self-cultivation. So I don't think we necessarily need to throw rule-based approaches to morality out if we are having robots morally reason at all. But we should be careful about thinking about how we're using them, where they're coming from, whose norms and values and perspectives are being encoded in, and why.
Professor, you argue that surveillance-oriented educational robots can unintentionally deepen the school to prison pipeline. What safeguards or design principles would you insist on before deploying robots in schools?
Yeah, so this is sort of what I talked about at the very beginning, right? Where I think that, and it sort of ties to what I talked about at the beginning with what I just talked about, right? If you are designing robots in educational environments to um, identify problematic behavior and to call that out, you need to think really carefully about whose specific norms of behavior are being encoded into those robots. What might the implications be of calling out those behaviors, both in terms of like, well, is the robot just saying this to the kid, and then it's just steering their behavior? Is it that the robot is logging this and it's going into their record? Is it that like there might be like law enforcement called or school administrators got involved or goes to the parents, right? All of which could have different types of, socio-technical consequences. And so here, I think this is something where again, roboticists should think about whose whose norms and values are encoded, what the implications of those norms and values being reinforced or enforced would be, and how to make sure that this is being done in a way where it's genuinely participatory with the communities involved, which could involve kids, parents, and teachers equally.
Professor, Confucian role ethics and engineering for social justice both play important roles in your proposals. How do these frameworks change the way we think about a good robot compared with typical Western ethics?
Yeah, so I think that Confucian role ethics changes the way we think about robots because it changes things in a way that encourages us to focus on social relational ontology, or what other philosophers have called like mixed ecologies, right? So this is the broader network of social technical systems, or the broader like actor networks uh, that comprise socio-technical systems, right? It encourages us to not just think about the robot's behavior or even the robot's behavior towards somebody else, but to pop things up to think about the network of agents, which includes both humans and robots, that interact with each other that comprise society. And I think this is helpful from the perspective of like feminist human robot interaction. So Katie Winkle has this awesome paper on feminist human robot interaction, which is basically just encouraging us to think about who are the people who are involved in a technology's deployment, including, the direct users, but also bystanders, the researchers themselves, funding institutions, etc., and to think about the power relationships between those parties and whether it may or may not be ethical and equitable, right? And so I think by taking a Confucian role ethics approach, it encourages us to map out those stakeholders, to think about the relationships between them, to think about how those relationships and the dynamics may or may not be equitable, where the power dynamics are, and think about how robots could be acting within those networks in ways that sort of subverts yeah, inequitable power dynamics and empowers users who otherwise may be disempowered.
Professor, in calling for an abolitionist robotics, you explicitly connect robotics to movements to move beyond policing. What does abolitionist robotics look like in practice for researchers, funders, and companies?
Yeah, um so going back to the to like what I was talking about before about these three different approaches, revising, rethinking, and ripping up with respect to police robots. Um, Here, this is something where I think this is important also because this is in some ways the motivation for this book, and what really got me pushing in a social justice perspective. My lab, like in like 2020, in the pandemic, and during the Black Lives Matter movement, we had already been doing some work on robot ethics and on things that connected to social justice in terms of issues of gender and whether robots were reinforcing stereotypes, but it wasn't really like a dominant lens we were taking. And then in 2020, I have this very clear memory of I live in Denver, Colorado, and being like on my balcony in my apartment building and looking down on the street and seeing like a police truck rolling by that full of like armored police. And then later, like half an hour later, those police were down the street from me, um, tear gassing people, shooting protesters with rubber bullets, all sorts of violence towards people in my community. And this really made me worry about are what happens when these police get more robots, right? Are robots going to be helping the police to surveil and to tear gas and to assault my neighbors? And so that evening, I reached out to a group of other Colorado roboticists and got them together to co-write this statement, which we ended up turning into a petition effort that we got over 100 roboticists around the world to sign, asking them not to collaborate with the police. And that is sort of, thinking about the and learning more about the history of policing and the history of race and technology and policing in the United States helped to push me in the direction of writing this book. Um, but in the aftermath, right, I've been thinking about how to actually be effective because on the one hand, great. 100 roboticists agreed not to collaborate with the police, but you know what? Most of us probably weren't going to anyways. I don't do anything close to that. I'm not building drones, right? Like my lab works on social robots, right? I'm not in the position. The one project we've had that has come close to collaborating with the police is we started looking at how local search and rescue operators for rescuing people from avalanches in the mountains, how they use dogs, how they train dogs, and whether there might be a metaphor there for designing robots. It turned out it wasn't going to be an effective project anyways, just because those search and rescue workers have no money, right? And they're not going to be able to afford the types of robots we're talking about, right? It's all volunteer. But also, we noticed with those in that domain that they basically have to work with the police. The police are coordinating everything, and so we were like, we don't feel comfortable with this. We took a step back. But other than that one like side project, we aren't going to be doing this anyways. So we've been thinking then, right, about yeah. So what are these other ways that we could change the story or shift perspectives on collaborations with the police. And so here, again, this might be something like designing robots for surveillance, where robots are watching the police. And this is something that people have done around the world, right? Using drones to document violence towards protesters, violence in Palestine, etc., right? But in addition, our lab has used this to motivate some of the work we do going forward. So we thought, for example, well, how are police currently using robots with communities where they might impact people in Denver, right? And one of the ways that you see police using robots is there's news stories about them clearing homeless encampments. And so we thought, you know, if the dominant narrative about robots and the unhoused is around the robots, like, clearing your encampments, destroying their homes, destroying their personal belongings, etc., which, by the way, is like, it's a huge problem, right? Because these people who are unhoused, who are maybe trying to get a job, trying to secure housing, and they just have their paperwork that they've been working for months to try to build towards those things, and then the police come through and clear their encampments, and all of their things get confiscated, and there's the paperwork they've been working on months to compile so they can no longer be homeless gets thrown away, right? So it's a huge problem. And so we thought, well, how might robots work with the unhoused in different ways? And that's what prompted us to start doing interviews with the organizations, to start doing design work, to really pursue this work with local unhoused shelters. And so, like, there we've gotten into those projects as a way of trying to rethink the narrative around the robots and those communities, because of the ways that police are currently using robots with those communities. And then again, finally, I think the most radical approach would be to think beyond what we're doing as roboticists, beyond what we're doing as designers, and think about how we can act as members of our communities, right? If, as roboticists, we recognize these problems of what happens when robots get a hold of, or when police get a hold of robots, maybe we should be working as members of our communities to try to stop these types of police technology acquisition, to try to pursue solutions to community safety that don't require police, or to pursue efforts that do away with the police entirely. And I think in the United States right now, things like police abolition are viewed as very radical and like unlikely, but we do see a lot of growing attention to efforts to like abolish ICE, of saying, maybe we shouldn't have secret police going around and like kidnapping people because of the color of their skin. Like, why do we have these people to begin with, right? And so that's a type of police abolition where there actually is a lot of traction. And I think that shows how some of these efforts are maybe not as wild or radical as people might think.
Professor Tom, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. For young robotists who love the technical challenges but are newly aware of these power dynamics, what are the three concrete steps they can take to ensure their work subverts rather than reinforces existing oppression?
Yeah, so I think that here, concrete things that we can do is one, self-education. So like reading, not just like, this isn't a secret pitch for my book, right? I mean, yes, read the book, right? But like reading more broadly and educating ourselves on these issues, because these are types of things that like technologists don't get trained in, right? Like if I look at like my robot ethics classes, when we need to talk about issues of like race and gender and colonialism, the percentage of my students who have had the opportunity to take classes in things that are related to that is like 2%. It's like maybe one student out of 50 has had the opportunity to take a class in something like that, which means that if we want to understand the ways that these forces operate in contemporary society, we need to be doing self-education and reading on these topics. The second is taking a participatory lens and trying to make sure that we are thinking carefully about, well, who is this work actually serving, and how can we work with communities to make sure that with the communities that we want our technology to help, to make sure it's designed in a way that not just could hypothetically help them, but is really designed in a way that would genuinely help them and will be deployed into their communities. And then finally, I think a concrete way we can help is by sharing with others, right? I think that as an educator, as a professor, I am uniquely able to help to change conversations around these issues and help to educate the next generation of roboticists in ways that make them less likely to to design robots that play into these, problematic patterns. I recognize that, like, if I were in industry, I could maybe have an effect, but it's going to be limited, right? I'm going to have some amount of effect within my company, and especially if I didn't have a PhD and I was just like a robotics engineer, right? And I'm just like taking orders on like what we're designing. There's might be a limited effect that I, as an individual, might have. Whereas as an educator, if I'm able to tell, 50 or 100 students a year about these problems, then maybe I'm going to be able to, through collective effort, we're able to have a more of an effect on the way that industry goes. And so I'm not saying that everybody needs to become a professor or go into education, but there's ways that all of us can share what we know with others, whether that's just through casual conversations, whether that's through what we speak up about in our design meetings when we go and work at companies, or whether that's through larger outreach efforts when we do public outreach to engage the communities, engage communities to learn about robotics in general.
Professor Tom Williams, thank you for sharing such thoughtful and nuanced insight with us today. Your work challenges us to rethink not only how we design robots, but also whose values and futures those designs ultimately serve. It has been a privilege to learn from you, and I am sure our listeners will carry this reflection into their work and conversations. We look forward to following your continued contribution to robotics and social justice, and we hope to host you again on Business Talk in the future. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much.